Okay, I'm just going to share my screen because I've got a very basic PowerPoint. Okay, so yeah, as advertised, this talk's called Goodman and the World Behind the Schemes, which is an allusion to Tim Button's Behind the Schemes argument against conceptual relativism, which in his book, The Limits of Realism, although I won't be addressing Button directly, I do talk about it also in a forthcoming piece for Identities on Goodman and art and conceptual art. So what I want to focus on today, as the name, as the title of the piece implies, is what we understand by a world in Goodman's account. When we talk about ways of world making, what is a world, and in a sense, how might Goodman answer various realist objections to the idea that there are multiple worlds. I guess the thrust of this paper is sort of skeptical, but and I kind of want to press towards the end towards some idea of a sort of transworld ontology, or an ontology which in a sense is independent of Goodman type worlds, whatever they are. Which may not convince you, but in any case, there are two. Let's see. Okay, so there are two issues I want to focus on. One of them, using I think a neat term that Alexandre Declos introduces, is Goodman's pluriworldism, the claim that there is not one true world, but many worlds, each answering to different and often conflicting world versions. That's the kind of heart, as I take it, of Goodman's anti-realism. Then the second claim, which I'm not going to focus on quite so much, but it's sort of implicit in a lot of what I'm going to talk about, is that these worlds are in some sense made by human symbolic practices. So in this talk, I want to first set out pluriworldism and the world-making thesis. And then secondly, to consider whether each is supportable by examining a range of objections to them. So, you know, does the very idea of world-making, for example, presuppose a world behind the schemes, as Button argues? Does the production of worlds presuppose a kind of identity or process that is non-world dependent? Can we make sense of comparisons or translations or interpretations of one world of the other, and what are the conditions of that? So what are the conditions, if you like, of radical interpretation for worlds? So there's a range of issues that I want to address. So firstly, I take Goodman's pluriworldism to be equivalent to the claim that the world has no structure that is significantly mind independent. The structure of worlds, in the sense that Goodman talks about, depend on how they're differentiated or sorted into kinds by symbol users. According to Goodman, symbols literally make worlds because our symbolic practices fix how certain entities are sorted, re-identified, and differentiated. Symbol use generates distinct world versions. A version constitutes its world by being true of it. So that's a distinction I want to observe throughout the talk between a world and a world version, which is kind of explained rather neatly by Goodman in this quote from his essay Star Making. Let's begin by acknowledging that a right version and its world are different. A version saying that there's a star up there is not itself bright or far off, and the star is not made up of letters. On the other hand, saying that there is a star up there and saying that the statement "there is a star up there" is true. I may have misquoted. Amounts to much the same thing, even though one seems to talk about the star and the other to talk about the statement. What is more important, we cannot find any world feature independent of all versions. Whatever can be said truly of a world is dependent on the saying. Not that whatever we say is true, but that whatever we say truly or otherwise present rightly is nevertheless informed by and relative to the language or other symbol system we use. No firm line can be drawn between world features that are discourse dependent and those that are not. So the key take home here is that a world version is, if you like, the symbolic system which denotes or represents a world, and a world is, in a sense, what answers to a right description of it. But when I'm talking about versions, I'm talking about something that's essentially symbolic, whereas when I'm talking about worlds, I'm talking about what those versions in some sense represent. And just to hammer home this issue about repetition and similarity, the allocation of things to kinds, whether events are treated as repetitions or of a repeatable type or quality, or as even, essence, and singular, depend on how worlds are symbolically sorted by versions rather than on any mind-independent nature. So that this is a quote from Ways of Worldmaking. Repetition as well as identification is relative to organization. A world may be unmanageably heterogeneous, or unbearably monotonous according to how events are sorted into kinds. So this is kind of two flavors, if you like, of Goodman's anti-realism, that it's versions, if you like, which impose structure on worlds, not some kind of mind-independent real differences and similarities and structures out in the world. Another point that's important to stress, although I probably won't be giving it due weight today, is that versions can be linguistic or non-linguistic. For example, Cezanne's uniform brushwork differentiates the things depicted in his work, Mont Saint-Victoire, etc., differently from the way the graduated tones of 19th century academic painting do. So differentiation could be, as Goodman points out, can be a matter of emphasis rather than conceptual categorization. So let's consider some examples of purported world making. The first one I'm going to consider is the ontology of musical works. According to Goodman, musical works are symbolic artifacts. Modern musical works, he argues, are individuated by belonging to the class of performances that comply with the notation on a musical score. Thus, any given piano performance is a repetition of Debussy's Clair de Lune, if and only if the performer performs the correct notes with the correct timing as specified in the original score. So it's the class of performances of Clair de Lune, if you like, the compliance class of actions performed by pianists which correspond to the notes on the score. And that relationship individuates that work. That, in a sense, allows us to distinguish between the individual performances of a work and the identical work that is performed each time. Without that, Goodman argues, you don't get this distinction between work and performance, at least not in anything like the same way. And it's worth mentioning here that notation, when we talk about notational schemes, that's a highly specific kind of symbolic scheme for Goodman. Notations so for example, Western musical notation exhibits all the necessary features of Goodman's notational systems. They're syntactically disjoint, no character stands for more than one symbol, so a middle C here, you know, there's no other, there's no kind of, there's a middle C here and an A just below it. There's no sort of character in between that would stand for something. Well, there'd be a G and sharps, but there are only certain number of characters possible, and given any notes on the stave, it's possible to determine which note they stand for. So they're syntactically disjoint. There's no ambiguity about which symbols these are, and they're finitely differentiated. It's possible to determine which symbol or character belongs to. They're also semantically differentiated. Where two characters differ in meaning, it's always possible to tell that they differ in meaning. By contrast, paintings and non-digital images are syntactically dense, because whereas here, if you change the position, not all changes of position on a stave will be significant, whereas any change of position or any change in hue or shape or position on a painting can be semantically significant. And paintings are also semantically replete, according to Goodman. There are lots of different multiple features that are constitutive of the meaning. So the fact that a score is syntactically and semantically differentiated, the fact that, you know, that there's that only certain differences are significant on the score, means that the score can have a very determinate compliance class. There's no, if you like, there's no ambiguity about whether a particular performance would be an instance of Clair de Lune or not. You can't be a bit more or a bit less Clair de Lune. Of course, you can make mistakes, but the mistakes will be relative to the score. Whereas if you take a notation, a visual score, graphic score, like Cage's score for in the concert for piano and orchestra, here the various intensities or values are represented by distances, perpendicular distances between these dots and these lines. So that, in a sense, the musician has to interpret these in a way such that, in a sense, any difference could be potentially significant, and therefore there's no procedure for determining when a variation in distances produces a new character. Any arbitrary variation in distance could, in a sense, be significant. So in a sense, it's not possible to determine absolutely whether a particular performance complies with this or not, or to absolutely differentiate them. So this is one example of world making, arguably, the fact that given the presence of notational systems in music, we can absolutely identify and distinguish cases which are performance of a work and cases which are not. And that makes possible the very difference between the musical work and its instances. Without that, you wouldn't have the modern musical work. However, maybe this example is a bit too frictionless. After all, musical works are just human artifacts, and it's less controversial to claim that the differentiation of human artifacts depends on convention than to claim that the differentiation of the non-human world depends on it, though we might take issue with both claims. Maybe a more generalized example is required, which in a sense could help us think about how ontology in general might be relative to version or to conceptual scheme. So I'm going to use an example from Hilary Putnam's work. Hilary Putnam's internal realism, as I was mentioning to Sepideh earlier, resembles Goodman's irrealism in certain respects. And his example is that of a toy world consisting of three basic atomic individuals, call them X1, X2, and X3. And we're meant to ask, well, given this universe, how many objects does this universe contain? And what both Putnam and Goodman want to say is that, well, that's relative to how we talk about that universe. If we have a language that allows that allows us to talk about what are called mereological sums, that is, sums of arbitrary sums of objects which combine to make a new object, and they're represented by plus signs, then we have not 3 objects but 7 objects. We have the original 3 objects, then we have x1 plus x2, which is a new object, x1 plus x3. Actually, that shouldn't be x2 plus x2. That should be x2 plus x3. Sorry about that. And that shouldn't be x2 plus x2, but it should be x1 plus x2 plus x3. So sorry about that. Shows my PowerPoint was arranged in haste. So according to Goodman, and I think according to Putnam, we've got a case here where really what's true of this world depends on how we talk about it. If we have a language without mereology, we've just got these 3 objects. If we have a language with mereology, we can start making, referring back to that statement, that long quote in Star Making, we can start making truth claims about mereological sums, which happen to be true about that universe too. So we have not 3 objects, but not the original 3 objects, but those objects plus another 4 form from the mereological summation operation. Of course, if we had a language which allowed set theory, arguably we'd have an infinite number of objects in such a universe, because the universe would contain the null set, and from the null set we can form the whole series of natural numbers through the operation of set union. So we can get the whole infinity of natural numbers and then various higher orders of infinity. So a universe with a world version with sets would actually include even more objects. Certainly more than 7. So for Putnam, like Goodman, there's no fact to the matter about whether mereology is true or false, and thus no ultimate fact to the matter about how many things there are. It all comes down to whether it's useful, if you like, to range over mereological sums of atomic individuals, sets, numbers, or individuals or not. You know, as soon as we've got this new language, we can make truth claims about it, and if they're true, we have a world answer. We must have a world answering to those truths. Obviously, the idea of mereological sums is kind of weird, as Ellie Hirsch observes. In ordinary life, we don't think about and talk about, for example, the mereological sum of Kristen Stewart's left ear and my audio interface. They're 2 disparate objects with nothing in common in different parts of the world. But if you've got language plus mereology, you can in a sense form that object or describe that object, even though the parts of the object are completely disparate in time and space. So nobody's suggesting that, in a sense, this kind of mereological summation conforms to common sense, but we can talk about it in a perfectly consistent way. We can adopt such a symbolic scheme, and once we've adopted it, then it's possible to make true claims about mereological sums. Thus, it seems that there are some things that could be stated truly of a mereological world that cannot be said of a non-mereological world about the existence and features of mereological sums. A right version of a mereological world, insofar as it is right, must include true statements about such sums. Now, ordinarily, a claim about some kind of entity cannot be true unless it successfully refers to entities of that kind. If I'm going to talk about anything, intuitively, if I'm going to talk about Martians, and I'm going to say make truth claims about Martians, there must be Martians to make truth claims about them. So if we allow that the mereological statements contain that we can form with these extra logical resources are true, then there must be things answering to those truth claims. So it seems to follow that a condition of a version being right is the existence of the relevant world organized and ordered in line with it. Thus, producing any right version of any world, it seems, implies existence of the correlative world. Now, at this point, a realist critic of Goodman might smell a rat. Maybe all that is at issue between world versions is a matter of the meanings of the sentences or non-linguistic symbols which rightly depict it. That is, this is really, in the end, surely just about rearranging relations of reference and denotation. It's just semantics, it's not ontology. If so, the realist might insist that it's hyperbolic to claim that for each true world version there are different worlds. Rather, producing a new world version just generates new truths. Sentences that mean different things will clearly have different truth conditions. However, this does not imply, the realist might go on to say, that by making sentences mean different things, we also make the worlds or things that they're true of. Okay, so let's explore this point with a further example. I want to use an example from the metaphysics of sound. Now, there are three main kinds of sound ontology or sonic ontology: proximal theories, which identify sound with qualia of auditory sensations, that is, properties of auditory experience; medial theories, which treat sounds as transmission of acoustic energy; and theories that treat sound as events literally located in sounding objects or sound producing systems. So depending on which of these theories one holds, one will locate sounds either in the head, in the mind, in the media through which compression waves travel, or in sounding objects and assemblages. Each sonic ontology then minimally implies a different interpretation function from parts of speech denoting sounds to the domain of physical or psychophysical entities. Some of these produce different distributions of truth regarding common claims about audition. For example, according to the relational event theory of Casey O'Callaghan, sounds are disturbances of a medium caused by a vibrating object. According to the located event theory, they're vibrations in the objects themselves. So in the first case, a tuning fork in an evacuated jar or in the vacuum of space, even if it's vibrating at a certain frequency, makes no sound. That is, if you think that sounds are disturbances of a medium, a tuning fork in a vacuum makes no sound. However, if you think that sounds are vibrations or resonance events in objects themselves, then it's perfectly consistent to say that there are sounds in the vacuum of space wherever materials are vibrating. Now, if Goodman is right, there's no uniquely right way of achieving this mapping, although each world version in our sound ontologies will have to exhibit super-empirical virtues such as coherence, simplicity, beauty, and explanatory fruitfulness. So, and you know, there are pros and cons to each of them. Proximal theories may account for the qualitative aspects of sounds directly, but are less easy to reconcile with our ordinary intuitions about the locations of sounds. Because, you know, a proximal theory says roughly that a sound is the sensory experience or property of the sensory experience of an auditory event. So there's no problem about, if you like, saying how sounds relate to our experience of sounds. Sounds, in a sense, just are our experience of sounds, according to this account. Located theories, on the other hand, do better justice to the idea and our intuitive sense that sounds are somehow out in the world. That you know, when you hear a dog bark in the distance, that's something occurring out in space. But they have more difficulty kind of reconciling the situatedness or locatedness of sounds with the claim that sounds also have these sensory qualities like pitch or timbre, because those don't reduce easily from the physical properties of sound. Now, if the realist insists that there must be some right way of passing the sound world, Goodman's irrealist or pluriworldist will answer that any such candidate for a true world will just answer to another version, another practice of describing, locating, and sorting sounds. The location and sorting sounds appears counterintuitively to be discourse dependent. Now, at this point, the realist might respond that merely shuffling around formal semantic relations of reference does not generate a new world at all, just different ways of talking. This is going back to the earlier objection. In this instance, both the proximal theorist and the located events theorist agree that there are resonance events and auditory experience. It's just that in proximal theory, sound refers to some features of auditory or mental processing, while for the located event theorist, it refers to a resonance event in an object. So is what seemed like an ontological debate really just a question of how we shuffle around relations of reference between parts of speech referring to sounds? Interestingly, this is a conceptual disparity as well, which can affect our experience of sound. As I observed, the relational event and located event theories give different answers to when and where sounds occur. So suppose you hear a tuning fork in a jar filled with air, and the air is subsequently pumped out, leaving a silently vibrating tuning fork. I think most people may judge that there is no longer any sound going on here, as per the relational event theory. Yet, were the air in the jar containing a vibrating tuning fork to be regularly evacuated and replenished, we would likely hear this as an alteration in the conditions of audition of a single continuous sound, rather than the alternating presence and absence of successive sounds. I was looking online to see if anybody had actually done that. It would be nice to give you a video, but I couldn't find any, so we just have to imagine it. So the two theories trade truth values between particular judgments, whilst doing equal justice to the conceptual framework within which sounds are identified, located, and sorted. Arguably, there's not much to choose between them, but they do generate different truth. They do generate contrary truth claims. Now, it might seem hyperbolic to claim that an auditor who shifted between these perspectives on seeing the alternating replenishment and evacuation of the jar is living in a different world with a different auditory ontology, just rather than just using the word sound equivocally or applying different concepts to identical systems. That, I think, would be the initial response of the robust realist, and I think it's the right one up to a point. making our words mean different things and thus creating different truths and falsehoods about the world does not literally generate new objects, just new things to say about the objects already there. However, things aren't quite so simple. The complexity arises because, as advertised, each theory of sound needs to elaborate a different and coherent metaphysics. Thus, if we go for either type of event theory, we still need to explain how it is that physical events in objects or their surrounding media can have sensory properties. And in the case of proximal theories, this is, as we've seen, this is relatively frictionless. But to account for the sensory properties of located events, we might need to introduce various supplementary hypotheses, such as the claim that the auditory sensory properties are dispositional properties of sound. So we could say something like a sound has a pitch of consonant A if we're disposed or if we're disposed to hear. No, that wouldn't be a good example. We could say that a sound, a particular sound has the timbre of a clarinet if it is disposed to cause an ordinary human listener to hear something like that clarinet sound. Or we could argue that there are properties of sound, sensory properties of sounds, which are non-physical, but which in some way depend on the physical properties of those events. But either way, we're going to have to do a bit of additional work to sort of integrate the sensory properties of sound within the located events model. Now, so I mean, at this point, you know, I think, you know, the debate between the archetypical robust realist and the Goodman-esque pluriworldist, I think is still still unsettled. I guess one thing we might ask Goodman or Goodman's epigones here is whether whether there really are I mean, one thing we could ask is whether there really are sort of multiple equally right versions. I mean, one of the assumptions behind Goodman's account is we need, in a sense, these multiple worlds to take account of the fact that there can be equally right but often incompatible versions, as in the case of the language with Mereology and the language without Mereology. I mean, one way to respond to this is to really go whole hog realist and say, well, maybe there's only, whatever Goodman wants to say, perhaps there's only one true theory of the world. Maybe this languishes at the ideal end of science, or I've lost my screen share. Maybe this language is at the ideal end of science, or maybe it's in the mind of God. That might be one thing they could press Goodman on. But as Hilary Putnam's argued, it is fairly that's a pretty extreme sort of realism. And I mean, Putnam has shown, with the aid of a theory and model theory, that this idea of a one true theory is deeply problematic. So what Putnam has shown, using a theorem of branch of logical model theory, is that if you can imagine a language of some ideal theory, it's this brilliant theory of everything. It makes all the correct predictions. It's beautiful as you like. It's as consistent. It's consistent. It has all the super empirical virtues you could want. But he's argued that basically, if you take such a theory, you can generate another equally good theory simply by shuffling around the relations of reference between the parts of the formal system of the first theory and the domain of objects over which that theory refers to. So it might be that so Putnam's theory states that for any language whose referring expressions are mapped onto objects in a range of possible worlds, which are called models, by an interpretation function I, there will always be a second interpretation function J that maps the same expressions onto different objects picked from the same world, which preserve the truth and falsity of the sentences of the language. Thus, the general term cat might refer to the set of cats under the first interpretation function, but to the set of cherries under the second interpretation function. But that will not affect the truth value of a sentence like Fred is a cat, so long as the new interpretation J maps Fred onto the member of the set of cherries. So if Fred is a cat will remain true under J, but will mean something different. So this is sometimes called Putnam's permutation argument against metaphysical realism. And if that goes through, then there can't be one unique theory of the world. If there's at least one unique theory of the world, there must be more than one that we can generate simply by shuffling around the relations of reference that link the parts of the theory to the things that the theory refers to. However, as Michael Devitt has observed, this is really just an argument against realism plus a very demanding theory of reference. Strictly, a metaphysical realist is just committed to the claim that reality consists of things whose properties and relations are mind and language independent. And it's far from obvious that this entails that there has to be some uniquely true theory. So one way of getting at this is to state what I call a correlational assumption behind Goodman's account, namely that each right version has a sort of unique world answering to it. Given any two distinct incompatible right versions, V1, V2, V1 has a uniquely correlated world, W1, V2 has a uniquely correlated world, W2, such that they're different. Well, obviously that's implied so why could it be, for example, that multiple right versions of the world could refer to the same world, in which case that would undermine the argument for pluriworldism. So this seems to be something like the correlational assumption. I mean, I'm sure we could put it in a more sophisticated way, seems to be built into Goodman's argument. Now, to begin to respond to this issue, I want to think a bit more about about different meanings that we might attach to the term world. Alexandre Desclos has usefully distinguished between a metaphysical conception of world as a maximally inclusive totality of all there is, and a schematic sense of the term world. A schematic world is always identified relative to some framework or context. So we could talk about the world of the medieval Europe, or the world of Lord of the Rings, for example. Whereas the metaphysical sense is that of a more familiar, absolute reality that incorporates everything. Now, clearly, a Goodman-esque world is schematic, although it can also be exhaustive insofar as, from any given perspective, that world could be all that there is. Meanwhile, Goodman ridicules the very idea of a metaphysically absolutist world in itself as a world well lost, arguing that it is a world considered without order, motion, distinction, or pattern, since these imply a version and a perspective from which order, distinction, motion, and pattern are observed. I'm not sure, though, that this is a very convincing rebuttal, since there's nothing that precludes an absolute reality having patterns or structures that obtain regardless of whether we're aware of them. Reality might even have properties that no finite creature could be aware of and which could not occur in a humanly possible, or be referred to in a humanly possible version, simply because we lack the means to detect those properties. So maybe things are at an impasse again. I think we can sort of put a bit of pressure on Goodman here. And one way to do that is to distinguish between different kinds of fact. That is, or more precisely, between what are called fine-grained or structured facts, as opposed to unstructured or coarse facts. A structured fact is what Putnam describes somewhere, I can't remember where, as a sentence-shaped thing in the world, built up from objects, their properties, and logical operations upon them. It is a fact under, if you like, a particular mode of presentation or description. So the sentence George Orwell is the author of 1984, and the sentence the author of Animal Farm is the author of 1984, express different fine-grained facts, but the same unstructured fact. They both, in a sense, stating that George Orwell wrote 1984, but they present Orwell in different ways in each sentence. So in each case, we have a different structured fact, but the same underlying, if you like, brute or coarse fact. Similarly, the sentence X is red and X is either red or square or red and not square express different structured facts, but the same unstructured facts, since they're logically equivalent. That is, X is red and X is either red or square or red and not square will be true so long as X is red, and not true if not true if X is not red. Actually, I might need to rewrite that. That should probably be a conjunction rather than alternation, rather than disjunction. But anyway, the point is the distinction between structured and unstructured facts is a distinction, if you like, between the way facts are presented and different structured facts, in a sense, can be made true, according to this account, by the same unstructured fact, which is roughly how things are in the world. The same non-linguistic state of reality renders a range of structured, a range of propositions, and thus a range of structured facts as obtaining or true. Suppose worlds, whether there are many or one, are composed exclusively of coarse facts. Maybe that's just the metaphysics of the world is coarse. Then there's no barrier to allowing that the same world could answer to more than one version. This is because a coarse fact is not intentionally characterized by the sentences it renders true or false. It may thus act as a truth maker for multiple incompatible right versions. Now, one may ask how we are to characterize coarse facts, if not as shadows cast by our language. And this is a legitimate question about the nature of reality, a problem for fundamental metaphysics. But there's another worry for the realist critic. How can we show that incompatible versions can differentially pass the same coarse facts or coarse world when the versions are, as it is assumed, when the versions represent these worlds very differently, often using non-linguistic forms of representation? We either efface those differences by some process of reduction, such as physicalism or phenomenalism, or some form of reduction, or let them remain in tension and contradiction. In the former case, there may be multiple such reductions whose claim to equivalence extend no further than to what Goodman calls extensional isomorphism. But extensional isomorphism only requires that the objects answering different versions have structurally equivalent roles. So you might have on the one hand the language of ordinary arithmetic, where we talk about numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and alternatively we might have the language of set theory, where we can generate, if you like, a proxy for the sequence of natural numbers using the null set, and then forming each successor of the series by unifying the previous successor with the with the set containing it. There's a procedure, in other words, for generating a proxy for arithmetic in set theory. But it doesn't follow that when we talk about numbers and when we talk about sets, we're necessarily talking about the same things, only that numbers and sets have a certain structural equivalence. So how do we settle whether, for example, statements in ordinary arithmetic and statements in set theory in some sense refer to the same course or mathematical truths? And again, to borrow an example from Elie Hirsch, and to refer back to my early example of Mereology, a non-Mereological language lacks the resources to say that there is a thing such that part of it is listening, namely Kristen Stewart's ear, and part of it is sounding, my computer audio interface. Because without Mereology, these are just two discrete objects, not parts of a sort of bizarre, spatially distributed object. And it's reasonable for the Mereologists to claim that the non-Mereological statement or the non-Mereological language cannot express a logically equivalent coarse Mereological fact. Once we've got a language that can do Mereological sums, we can obviously talk about the sum of Kristen Stewart's ear and my audio interface, but we can't do that without it. So I suppose Goodman or a supporter of Goodman could argue that the coarse-fine distinction only works from within a particular version, where we have the expressive resources to say how logically equivalent sentences with different meanings express the same coarse facts. Once we're outside, once we're comparing versions, it's not clear that there's any fact to the matter about whether two sentences with different meanings are true or false given the same underlying coarse fact. So it's not clear whether the coarse-fine distinction as I've represented is going to allow for multiple versions to be all true of the same, if you like, coarse, brute nature. So moving into the sort of last part of the talk, I want to consider a kind of, maybe an over-sophisticated or over-complicated, rather, response to this. It's a kind of Kantian style argument for what I call rather question-beggingly a transworld ontology that's somehow integrated into the very process by which worlds are understood and worlds, that is, or versions of worlds in Goodman's sense, understood and created. This is not without its problems, but I think it might segue into some sort of metaphysical argument about the deep structure of reality independent of any world or world versions in the Goodman sense. I think we can see where this goes by reverting to a kind of transcendental problem in, if you like, hermeneutics. What are the conditions under which disparate world versions can be intelligible and learnable, not only for their native users, but to other speakers or thinkers? Otherwise put, what is it that we learn when we learn a world version? According to Donald Davison, what we learn in the ordinary case is a capacity to predict what competent users of a language or version will say or do in an arbitrary wide range of situations. In the limit case of radical interpretation, when we're interpreting an alien language or version from scratch, this might require the production of some finitely expressible, fancy, formal theory for the language that's based on our observations of the behavior of their users. However, I'm not really concerned with the form of such an empirical theory of meaning. In the ordinary case, though, what we acquire is presumably a kind of social craft for evaluating and predicting the utterances, inferences, and actions of other speakers and users of the language or the version. Now, arguably, neither learning process, neither radical interpretation, nor the kind of more ordinary slippage between world versions that we see, for example, in the case of the tuning fork, neither process would be possible if we were not able to interpret what users of a version do by our own lights. That is, if users of different world versions are somehow kind of locked into their worlds, such that we couldn't compare what they do, say if we don't understand their version, we're trying to understand their version, what they're talking about, say what they're talking about when they talk about mereological sums. If they were kind of locked into a mereological world, we were locked into a non-mereological world, there'd be no way to acquire an understanding of that version. So what has to be true, it seems, if we can acquire an understanding of a different version, is that there's some common baseline against which we can compare our language use, or symbol use if we're talking about non-symbolic systems. So, for example, if a native speaker belongs to a culture whose members habitually refer to mereological sums, there must be a way in which a radical interpreter who lacks this culture, who isn't part of this culture, can still pick up on this semantic fact. Otherwise, arguably, that language wouldn't be learnable by anyone, even its own speakers. So to cut a long story short, the radical interpreter would presumably establish some theory, so some account of what statements about mereological sums, like those involving Stuart's left ear and my audio interface, perhaps initially by stating their truth conditions in their home idiom, maybe say, you know, so they might observe that whenever certain sentences that we from our God's eye view know to be about the mereological sum of Kristen Stewart's left ear and my Edirol interface, certain facts are true about these individual objects, that there's a kind of covariance, if you like, between certain things that can be said in the home idiom of the interpreter and certain as yet underinterpreted sentences in the alien mereological idiom. So for Davison, this is possible because language, this kind of process of learning about a language, even an alien language, is possible because language use allows each interpreter to triangulate the attitudes and responses of other agents, comparing what they say when and how they talk about the world. And for Davison, this intersubjectivity, which is in a sense a condition of learning any kind of idiom, presupposes that interpreters understand at some level that there's a common objective world about which either one can be right or wrong. So in the classical process of radical interpretation, you have a kind of field anthropologist who wants, who may say see a native, in Quine's example, a native point at a rabbit and say Taghvaei, and maybe throw a spear at it, and the anthropologist will, come up with certain theories of what Taghvaei means, and there are a range of theories, arguably, that may be consistent. It might be that Taghvaei refers to a whole rabbit, or an undetached rabbit part, or a certain time slice of a rabbit, or maybe a mereological sum of a rabbit and a nearby tree. I mean, all of these are kind of in, ideally could be in contention until we're in a position to compare this bit of language use with lots of others and produce hopefully some consistent theory which predicts more or less seamlessly what the natives will do. But for this process to work, there has to be some common framework. There's some common world. And it's worth saying that this also requires what Davison and others call the assumption of charity. We can only begin to do this if we assume that the natives aren't totally deluded about their world. Because if they're totally deluded, then nothing about their environment is going to give us a clue about what their words mean. They could be, if they're in the matrix, they might be in some virtual reality or hallucinating, but then we can't tell what they're talking about. But so we do assume a large degree of truth and coherence, even if we don't know what it is that they're talking about. So all that seems to point to the idea that a condition of understanding any kind of symbolic scheme is a common world, not just a Goodman-esque world that's, if you like, merely answering to a particular version or language. But a reasonable response to this, well, what is the nature, is to ask what the nature of this common world is. What is it, if you like, that we understand when we understand that there is a common world that I might share with somebody who has a pretty alien world version in Goodman's sense? Presumably, it's not some kind of straight metaphysical realist world. It's not the one true world that's represented in Putnam's one true theory. Because whatever world this is, it has to allow people coming from very disparate bodies of belief to ultimately come to understand each other, to have what Gadamer calls the fusion of horizons. So it can't be an absolutely true metaphysical world. It can't be a kind of absolutely transcendent and unspeakable one either. It must have some kind of structure. So what kind of world are we talking about here? It doesn't seem to be either the metaphysical world or the contextually determined schematic world as that Duclos describes. Jeff Malpass has argued that a candidate for this idea of the common world might be given in the phenomenological writings of Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger, as well as people like Gadamer or Merleau-Ponty. The core idea here is that the objectivity of a thing does not only consist of it being given under one mode of presentation, but always having an open horizon of potential modes of presentation. So, you know, whatever version we've got going, when we, for example, when Heidegger's hammer falls off the workbench as the cat knocks it over, there might be many others that we could, if you like, arrive at. So I may think of that hammer as a force amplifier, as a birthday present, but, you know, always aware, even for within my culture, my language, that that hammer could be disclosed in other ways. And that possibility, according to Malthus's reading of Davidson's Common World, is always implicit in any kind of experience of a world. So each perspective on the world, each version, if you like, is always nested in a horizon of potential perspectives, according to this view. And we can see the same idea in operation, the tuning fork example. We can see the tuning fork as intermittently sounding, or slip into seeing it as sounding all the time and not always audibly. And in a sense, is kind of part of what it is to be in a world, to be able to slip from one to the other, to experiment perhaps with versions. And if we couldn't do that, we couldn't come up with any versions. So what I'm suggesting here in a very preliminary way is that a condition of possibility of something like Goodman's kind of world seems to be some kind of open horizon of possibilities nested in any given version, that versions can't, in a sense, be completely self-contained. Now, I think nonetheless that this is still a long way from robust realism. For one thing, this idea of this phenomenological idea of a world is very much a temporalized idea of a world given to some kind of transcendental subject, some subject in a sense which constitutes the flow of time that allows us to move from one version to another. And this, to my mind, is still too idealist, too anthropocentric, since just like Goodman's pluriworldism, it precludes a reality whose properties exceed human representational capacities, as well as requiring a kind of supernatural transparency of the subject who can, if you like, grasp these possibilities for becoming. So, you know, this is the point at which we kind of I can touch on something like the issue of posthumanism, because it seems that the form of this world is determined by the form of subjectivity that constitutes it. And if you're some kind of posthumanist as well, or some kind of robust realist, that isn't quite good enough. So if we want something like a transworld ontology that in a sense opens up, which in a sense gets at the idea that any given version is, if you like, a becoming from another version, or could, if you like, morph into other potential versions, and it's kind of intrinsic to their function that they are, if you like, so situated within this, if you like, plane of possible becomings. We perhaps need to look for some kind of a different ontology. I mean, we might, and this is where things get very, I'm going to be deliberately hazy and schematic. So we might look to something like Deleuze's ontology, which places the generative temporality here no longer on the side of the subject, but on the side of the event, as a sort of dynamic process in the world through which various actualities, include assemblages, form. So this deals with becomings as an impersonal, immanently structured transcendental field, but a field that's still consistent with some kind of realism. So for example, Deleuze's ontology, as well as having a theory of the event, has a theory of ideas or multiplicities, which are mind-independent structures, which, in a sense, inform the various becomings that are possible. In some cases, they may have a kind of mathematical form. So there may be, if you like, a way of getting from this idea of a world as a sort of process of becoming to various forms of realism. And as Daniel Sacalotto said, there seems to be a kind of connection here between Deleuze's ontology and structural realism. So Deleuzean ontology might allow a different way of integrating a form of metaphysical realism, admittedly of a rather weird non-representational kind, not the sort that Putnam was railing against in his middle period, with some kind of transworld horizontality. And to finish, I mean, I've argued in my paper for Identities that a similar kind of ontology could be derived from another sort of French thinker, Derrida, in his account of events as iterable particulars or iterable processes. Because insofar as Goodman's account presupposes symbol use, it presupposes, as its functional symbol systems of various kinds, I've argued that it requires some kind of transworld repetition between these signs. That is, it allows signs to be repeated from one version into another version, such that if that's the case, it must be the case that there are certain structures, certain repetitions that don't depend on some kind of world to order them. They're actually a condition of possibility for worlding rather than being produced by a world version. So again, that's another way in which we might put pressure on Goodman using a kind of transcendental argument by suggesting that there are certain structures that must be in place for something like a world version to be possible, such that these structures don't actually depend on some kind of prior symbolic ordering. They are a condition of that symbolic ordering. So that's kind of where I'm winding up, I think, for tonight. I guess I come at Goodman's work kind of with probably quite entrenched skepticism, and I guess that's. But I admit that it's, you know, his anti-realist position is quite hard to rebut, and I'm not pretending that any of the arguments I've been kind of playing with are conclusive. I think they're just sort of tentative attempts to suggest how we might develop from different traditions some kind of realist response to pluriworldism. And I think their interest, I mean, I think the interest of Goodman's work isn't just in a sense how we apply it, but how we can respond to it, how it forces us to, in a sense, make our realisms or our posthumans sophisticated enough to address the problems it presents us with. So that's it.
Thank you, David. What a fascinating talk. I want to invite our attendees to join the discussion. If you have any questions, come off mute and participate. Or you can type it in the chat and I'll read it. Thank you, David. That was so fascinating. Okay, Martin.
I have a kind of long, complicated question. So if anybody wants to go before me, I should give he or she the chance to get in there.
It looks like there's a couple of hands up if you guys want to go first.
Yeah, I'll let you
or
sort it
Martin,
out.
Patrick, or Kirill.
Real was first.
Okay, thanks. Thanks a lot, David. I really appreciate your critique of Goodman, which is, yeah, really multifaceted. I'm definitely sympathetic to your realist intentions. I guess I wanted to perhaps bring back in something which is probably quite interesting to lots of people in the current audience, which is in terms of some of your earlier work, in terms of how aesthetics fits in here, and what I actually personally saw as a potential tension, which I think you said really interesting things about right at the end. That I kind of wanted to push on this to wonder whether this is still a component of your thinking or not, where I think sometimes it sounds to me like you're in danger of repeating something like Dreyfus's account, where we have a ground floor of affordances and solicitations, and then first floor of reasons and rationality. And I think there's quite interesting positions. So what Brandom dismissively calls hyperinferentialism, there's interesting readings by Kathy Legg saying that Peirce can actually be productively read as a hyperinferentialist, and what Peirce allows is quite a nuanced ontology, I guess. They're also, well, perhaps Deleuze is inspired by that as well. That's quite interesting in terms of referring to affects that are below the level of reason. So I sometimes worry that you are, as well as critiquing, also reabsorbing some of the kind of two-ply accounts of the people who you are critiquing, and perhaps you are sometimes a connoisseur of frictionless spinning in a void, as well as providing really robust challenges to it.
Right. Gonna have to do so. Yeah. Thanks, Kirill. That's very interesting, and I'm trying to sort of think about where to begin to respond. So, is it okay if I ask you about how we're using some of these terms? So, by hyperinferentialism, I understand the claim that meaning is constituted purely by inferential role, without any kind of sort of causal transaction between the symbol system and the world. Is that
Yeah, I guess I would kind of simply, so there's a neater version in Johanna Seif, where we can say there's a kind of a spectrum from reasons to causes. So reasons end up with no outer boundary, because anything that can present itself to reason can constitute reason. So things can be said to be within the space of reasons, like all the way down in terms of anything by which we're affected can be said to be playing a role within an inference, even if there is a kind of a spectrum to say, no, this type of thing is like a causal loop, and this type of thing is an inference. It's nonetheless, yeah, like a.
I see. So yeah, because that's helpful actually, because that moves us a bit closer to what to this kind of, all right, flirtation with Deleuze, and sort of, you know, effect, some kind of idea of effect. I mean, I don't know. I kind of find that just, I mean, my immediate response is that's kind of implausible. There seem to be so many kind of, there seem to be states of the body, states of the agent, which obviously can have a contributory sort of upstream effect on reasoning, but which themselves may have no. For example, they might just be too fast and evanescent, you know, to have any kind of persistent role within reasoning. I mean, the examples I use might be, you know, to sort of alluding to my common interest I have with Martin, you know, jazz improvisation. You know, when you're improvising, there's all sorts of stuff going on in the brain and the body, and all sorts of couplings happening between you and your instrument, which are just too fast, too quick, too obscure, really, to have some sort of consistent role in reasoning. But they obviously contribute to the various decisions you make in the course of the performance. So you kind of assume they're there, that you're reacting in certain ways, but it's not clear how they could be incorporated in the space of reasons.
McDowell's response to Dreyfus is that those responses are reasons. That is rationality. Being responsive is already rationality.
Yeah. I mean, I think for that to be true, I'd need a bit more argument. Like, well, you know, if they're in some sense part of rationality, then they must have some kind of role, some sort of functional role, which we could map onto some model of inference, presumably some kind of logical system. And I don't. It just doesn't seem to me that that's the best way to deal with them. Seems to me make much more sense. I mean, seems to me to make much more sense to think of them in terms of dynamics, maybe some kind of predictive processing. But again, that needn't be. That can just be dealt with in terms of systems that are simulating or simulating the world without necessarily reasoning about it. It sounds to me like I really need to read. I might ask you for some references, because that sounds absolutely fascinating. But I'm kind of not convinced that I need to fold here and say, well, you know, that in a sense, all these effective states are in some sense incorporable within the space of reasons, or some sort of process of rational belief fixation or whatsoever. I think I'd need to see more detail. Thanks.
All right, I'll ask if it's all right. So first of all, hi, nice to put a voice to it.
Hi, Patrick, nice to meet you.
Yeah. That was great. I'm not going to throw objections really, but just point out a couple of points where I think you might want to make some distinctions as you develop this moving forward. The first is, right, sort of a basic point that a lot of the realist responses to Goodman, take for granted this sort of intuition that, well, we must be referring to things, right, for our statements to be true. But in the quote that you pull from Star Making, right, he looks like a textbook statement of a deflationary theory of truth. So those concerns aren't going to, carving out a space for the realist is a fine project, but I don't know if the deflationary view of truth is going to make a difference to how you move forward with this. And I bring that up because it's related to a second point, which is that we might want to distinguish, and I don't know if this is going to work, but it's worth thinking about. We might want to distinguish between versions and languages and theories, because a version, right, it can be expressed correctly, right? There's already truth or normativity or however you want to put it built in, whereas a language or a theory, that's not quite right. So for example, you use the example of mereology, and you talk about the world, the non-mereological language and the mereological language, right? But just because a language has the expressive power to talk about mereology doesn't mean that unrestricted mereology is true. right? That doesn't mean that the expressive power of a language doesn't amount to a version. It doesn't seem to me. At least that's one way one might push back. Same with theories, arguably, right? I mean, depending how you want to carve this out, maybe theories of sound, right, are competing attempts to correctly articulate whatever version of the world has sound in it. These are just sort of points. And then
no, that's really interesting, Patrick. And I might sort of pick your brains a bit independently. I'm not. I mean, I'm not into. I can see that a version is it would need to be, and I'm not always clear what Goodman means by aversion, but it does seem to be. You're right. I think that it seems to entail certain expressive resources, but it seems to involve certain commitments, which would seem to make it more like, for example, akin at least to a system of belief, or
something like the web of belief, maybe.
And I guess a theory could be a sort of one way of could a theory be one possible way of expressing aversion?
I
don't know. As to the deflationary, I guess I'm never. I mean, I think one of the difficulties about engaging with Goodman, and that's why it sometimes feels a bit like wrestling with a greased pig, is that he doesn't have a particularly, he doesn't have a detailed theory of meaning or representation. So he certainly uses a kind of disquotational schema here. So he certainly says that, saying a star up there and saying the sentence, there is a star up there, is true, are equivalent. You need a bit more than that, presumably, to. I mean, that's a commonplace of any theory of truth. If you to be a deflationist, you'd have to say that, you'd have to add a rider into something to the effect that, and that's all there is we can say about truth. Which he doesn't do.
Close.
And when it comes to reference, well, I mean, we are in the position where he at least at a rhetorical level, he uses this claim to motivate something like an ontological claim about the, in a sense, lack of any difference between discursive and non-discursive structure in worlds. So even if he isn't sort of, and it has to be, and to be fair, in languages of art, and for example, he does talk about, he seems to be committed to there being real relations of reference or denotation. So even if he hasn't got a kind of a theory of, even if he hasn't got a philosophical semantics, you can read between the lines and I think impute a minimal one to him that's enough to get us to some kind of account of how versions relate to worlds. I mean, I think the minimal account is that versions are, or statements within, or that versions are in some sense true of worlds, in some woolly sense of true. I mean, in the sense of version is not a sentence. It may be I don't even know if, just referring back to your original point, whether a version is a collection of sentences or a collection of sentences could be a version. But, there's some kind of semantic relation, which is not necessarily a kind of formal one. But no, that's thanks for that kind of subtle intervention. That's really helpful if I'm if I'm masochistic enough to want to sort of go further with this.
Yep. Thanks.
Thanks, Patrick. That's great.
Hasia, go ahead, and then after that I'll read Magda's text, and then Martin.
Martin can go first.
Okay. So David, you know, I'm not very conversant with the Anglo tradition, and so this may come across as naive. And it's certainly basic. I'm trying to anchor down this notion of world making in relationship to first objects and then subjects and then events. My first experience as you began had a hard time with the ambiguity that the structures you propose could apply to either subjects or objects. Let's put events and a more Deleuzian reading a little bit later. So you began with Kristen Stewart's ear and your her left ear and your right audio speaker, or whatever the
connection could be. Yeah, it's a bit of a kid.
Yeah, and then you talked about a rabbit and a tree, right? And I was trying to see, well, does the tree and the rabbit have separate worlds? Or does Kristen Stewart have a different world from your audio ear, have a different world from your audio speaker?
Okay.
And so that really made it difficult for me to grasp what you're talking about. However, if you move toward a kind of monadology, you know, Leibniz and Spinoza and then what you were talking about with X1, X2 suggests that each were subject positions projecting different worlds. And then when you said X1 plus X2, that suggests a kind of structural coupling of two worlds, and then X1 plus X2 plus X3 becomes kind of a consensual domain. And so you can see how that ambiguity makes it really difficult for me to penetrate. But the second one suggests a kind of pluralistic phenomenology, which would be both sensory and symbolic. And let me push this a little further. If world making implies the agency of the maker, the subject position of the person projecting the world, and when you start thinking with reference to mirology, to the interference patterns of different worlds, then the collision becomes a kind of event. Now, how far off am I already in understanding what you're trying to do with Goodman? Because if we begin to talk about subject positions, competing subject positions, competing worlds, and therefore competing sensory and symbolic lives, that would create an opening for a post-human subjectivity projecting a very different kind of world. So how far off have I gotten by trying to bring, and you can see that just beginning with monadology and nomadology, you can see where Deleuze would suddenly mesh, speaking of world making and collisions, with what Nelson Goodman is up to. So I need correction here because otherwise I'm lost.
I think the point about, I mean, I think the example of Mereology was intended as a kind of toy example. So and you know, Putnam's argument there is simply that, or the claim is simply that there's no fact to the matter about whether a language without Mereology or a language with Mereology is the right way to represent this world, even though they both give different answers about, for example, to the question of how many things are in it. That's you know, it's just a kind of logical point that if we have a language which allows us to, an operator which allows us to talk about mereological sums, we can say things about the world that we can't say if we don't have that operator. And I think what Putnam and Goodman would both want to say is that these statements would be true of such a world, and therefore we get different answers about how many things are in that world depending on which language, which perspective we adopt. And you could identify each of these perspectives, if you wish, with a subject position. I mean, in a sense, that's part of what I think some theorists mean by a subject position. It's a kind of, it's a kind of a structured sort of set of structures which determine, in a sense, how you experience the world, what kind of things you take there to be, what kind of differences you think are important. For example, it might be, we might be talking about gender differences or sex differences. It doesn't have to be so abstract.
If I can create a parenthesis here, you can see why my interest lies with the fact that all of a sudden, by shifting from objects, symbolic objects, real objects, to subjects and subject positions, those diagrams and the language made a completely different kind of sense and a coherent sense. And I'm trying to see whether I'm forcing that
I don't think it's forced, Martin. I think, you can probably, I think you can probably make a line or a connection between some of what Goodman says and some of what, I don't know, some Lacanians say, for example, about the symbolic order, although there are differences, obviously, because, in Lacan, there's the real, which isn't sort of symbolized. So there's most post-structuralist accounts, there's always some non-symbolic surplus, which is kind of something I'm sympathetic to, I think, if it isn't obvious.
And just to add one more thing, when you shifted from standard music notation to Cage, you were going from a one world organization to a many worlds.
Yeah, I probably didn't. I probably didn't explain that very well.
Because those dots. I mean, you know, I've written about Cage and
yeah. I mean, you know this stuff better than I do. So
as phase space, as basically deliberately utilizing an epistemological shift in order to reorient music and silence on the basis of information theory rather than the mechanism, or what I call the calculus of music notation.
Yeah. I mean, this is an example that Goodman uses, the Cage score. And I mean, the point is a bit simpler. It's simply that using standard notation, we can check against any given performance whether it corresponds to the performance or not, because
it's a one world order. It's a one world order. Yeah.
And you know, just because of the syntax and the semantics of there are only certain moves, if you like, on the stave and certain marks or transitions between marks that are going to give us a new note. So we haven't got sort of lots of gradations between each mark, which might or might not correspond to something that the pianist does. You know, it gives us determinate answers to whether a performance is a case of clair de lune or not. So it's not so much a difference between one world and many worlds as between a world in which there's a performance work distinction and a world where that distinction simply can't operate, because which would probably be true, for example, of pre-modern musical notation, like music notation.
But this is why I think the Cage reference is really interesting, because those dots represent possible alternative futures for the history of the musical system.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, that's nice, Martin, because I mean, I realize that, you know, the emphasis all through this talk has been rather dry. It's been on on pluriworldism and realism rather than world making. And we might want to say that there is still something that, you know, there's something, even if we're realists or something like realists, that there's something we want to kind of recuperate from this idea of world building as sort of valuable. And that, I mean, that's not what I've been talking about, but I'll admit that for me is the world making stuff is actually more interesting than the irrealist stuff, because that sounds like something that we're all actually directly interested in, whether we do art or politics or engineering for that matter. And it's not, and it would be interesting, for example, to think about whether you could detach that sort of productive, sort of almost engineering approach to art and philosophy and technology and politics from a commitment to sort of some kind of anti-realist claim about you know, the nature of reality and the relationship between language or symbols and reality. So I'm kind of sympathetic to that, but I realize that's not quite what I've been doing. But you know, it's possible that sort of incorporating something like a Deleuzian or dynamicist, you know, account of the kind that you're interested in could actually contribute to that here, and could sort of, you know, if you like, detach these two kind of components of Goodman's account, the pluriworldism from the world making. I'm just, you know, I'm riffing here, to be honest.
Yeah.
I'm still not sure about that.
I appreciate the response, because as you can guess, this is new to me. So
well, I mean, and you know, I fully admit that you know, just because of the way I started bouncing off the text, it just became rather knotty and complicated, and you know, I was tripping myself up at various points because you know, it's complicated stuff.
All right, thank you, Martin. I want to offer the people that added to the chat to come off mute and ask your questions, if that's cool with you. But Cassia, go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you. First, I would like to thank you, David. That was a great presentation. And I don't know if I have one point to make or two, but I wrote some things during your talk. And first, when you talked about the different approaches to sound in regards to sound metaphysics, you said something like these different approaches do not generate new objects, but new ways of talking about them. And this kind of gets stuck into my mind because I was thinking in regards to the Carnapian legacy that remains in Goodman's work. In regards to the functionalization of the object, because objects and concepts are kind of like equivalent in some way. And when we approach an object with two different frameworks, it's like within the perspective of ontology as classification, we are already conceiving it as two different objects, in whether in art, science, or perception, and this causes something like an amplification of the operational resources that we have available to manipulate these objects or these objects. I think this comes back to the notion of system that is defined as a scheme applied to a realm of objects. And when we apply a different scheme, it's like we are reorganizing these objects, and this kind of like produce a new structure. And the second point concerns your objection in the end about a possible conception of a common word, a word behind the schemes that you describe as an open horizon of potential ways of presentation of or possibilities. In this, you regard as a consequence of the existence of preconditions for symbol use, and these preconditions you characterize as a word. But I'm more inclined to think that if we regard these preconditions as a word, we are already framing them in some way. We are already talking about them. We can only recognize them as a structured domain once we came up with some framework. And I think that maybe the answer is in this distinction that you made that was unknown to me until now, of fine-grained facts and unstructured facts, but I'm not certain. But I think that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Cassia. That's great. That's really a really good question. I can't give you. I don't think I can give you an entirely satisfactory answer. I think certainly for Carnap, whose work I don't know very well. This is one thing I probably need to make good over the next year. I'm not that conversant, but certainly for Carnap or Putnam, or I take it Goodman, that there is, the only ontological differences are differences within the various schemes that we use for conceptualizing the world. If these schemes kind of work, if we can use them well, and to make you know, for example, to make good predictive theories or to build bridges or whatever. In a sense, there's nothing more that we can't investigate the relationship between those and some ultimate reality, because in a sense, the only criteria we have to go on is their kind of their internal coherence and their effectiveness in, you know, allowing us to do what we want to do. I mean, I think there are, you know, I've got worries about that sort of, you know, meta ontology, if you like. I mean, one is that it, you know, I mean, the kind of classical realist response is that it can't explain why certain schemes, you know, work. And so, you know, why certain, you know, to avert to Goodman's work on induction, why certain predicates are projectable and certain predicates aren't. Whereas a realist account, in a sense, a realist would say that you know, inference to the best explanation would lead us to realism, because if we assume that the world is independently structured somehow, then that accounts for the fact that that making generalizations about certain kinds of things allows us to discover laws, you know, say, for example, biological species, rather than you know, other categorizations of the biological species won't allow us to discover laws, simply because we're carving the nature of the joints. We're actually, those generalizations are kind of tracking, you know, real cohesive properties out there in the world. So, you know, I guess one response might be the realist kind of inference to the best, realism as inference to the best explanation. I think your point about this idea of the common world being itself, if you like, another answering to another version, I think is a really subtle one, and I'm not sure if I can give you an entirely adequate response. My immediate response would be that that we don't, in a sense, the argument is not, in a sense, the argument is not dependent on presenting a particular well-framed, detailed account of this common world. Rather, the argument leads us to the conclusion that there must be something, some kind of baseline. The question is, well, what is that baseline? How do we best characterize it in a way that can account for the sort of mutual intelligibility or interpretability of different symbol systems or different belief systems? So I'm not sure if, I mean, I was throwing out some kind of potential models for this common world, but I don't think my argument's dependent on any one of them being adequate. They're meant to be illustrative. And indeed, if you know, I mean, if you're going to go the full Deleuzian mile or hog or whatever, if you're going to, you know, if you're going to take Deleuze at his word, you'd have to say that, well, actually, this structure can't be, you know, because it involves pre-individual difference, you know, difference in itself. It can't be entirely adequately conceptualized anyway. So in that sense, no version is going to be enough. But I'm not pretending that's going to satisfy you. That's just very much. I'm far from making my own mind up about this. I mean, I think you're right that actually, if I'm to take this further, I really need to probably burrow into Carnap in a big way and because obviously Goodman, particularly in structure of experience, is responding in a very direct way, as Putnam did a lot of his early work with Carnap. So a lot of this kind of anti-foundationalist ontology, which in a sense deflates the ontological significance of competing system, comes out of Carnap. So it would be interesting and useful to sort of delve more into his work. So thank you. Well, do come back. Sorry, I mean, I don't want to close off the question, but do come back if you wish.
Yeah, Cassia, do you want to take a minute to respond? If not,
sorry, I didn't mean to close off. That was
No, there's a lot of questions remaining. I think we can continue this discussion later and give space to other people. But thank you a lot.
It's really, thanks. The questions have been fantastic and really, really helpful for me. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cassia. Thank you, David. I'm going to read Magda's question. This world making has polaristic ways of existence, living being. This is possible to approach in the exact science as the native people did and do until now. This is a kind of regression to humanity, symbols of the body and nature.
Right. That's really interesting because I guess I guess this is, maybe I'm wrong, but this seems to be alluding to whether, in a sense, this account of world making might be very, if you like, anthropologically local to certain kind of Western conceptions of mind and body or mind and world. Maybe that I'm misinterpreting Magda's question, so I don't know if she wants to amplify on that, but that certain kinds of, that maybe other ways of thinking about the world would in a sense give us perhaps a different perspective on what we mean by world that I haven't been able to cover. Yeah, forgive me if I've misinterpreted the question too, because I'm as a non-anthropologist, I'm probably not very well equipped to answer it either. So I'm aware that I might be failing to pick up on what's really important here.
Magda, if you want to come off mute and ask your question in a way,
no, just
feel free.
Okay. It's just to think about this.
Yeah.
Because nowadays we need the symbols of nature to think technology, for example, because the native people, they are still here. And I think it is a world making that we need to think about and to learn about with the symbols, with this kind of living being.
Yeah.
And when we talk about world making, as I research about this, immediately I think, okay, and the symbols of the nature in this nowadays world. Yes, just to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I think
wow.
Nature biting back, barking back. I mean, I think because I've probably given a very formalist representation of what Goodman means by world, but I mean, he does allow that versions can be metaphors. They can be, it could be the version it could be the world of a 19th century novel or a poem. It doesn't have to be, sort of formal or mathematical or metaphysical. It could be, the way Cezanne or 19th century academic painting differ in the way they present, say, a bathing scene. It could be all those things. So I think to give Goodman his due, he is quite flexible and subtle in the way he develops the notion of a world and a world version. So it may be that, it does give us a way to think about, for example, how we distinguish nature, nature from non-nature, and what might be problematic about that. But I sorry if this is a very, it's a very kind of generic and inadequate answer, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you, Magda.
Thank you, Magda. Thank you, David. Simin has her hand up. Do you want to go ahead, Simin? Come off mute.
Yes. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Firstly, I want to say I don't speak English well, and I'm very excited. Sorry. And my question is about a score, and according to Steven Zepke article in write about a score in article, and a score in a score there in the score there are in a score setting and a list of events, and events relate to experience. And in the Goodman's view, a score is a score relates to experience or not, and in fact, a score and setting and list of events, and into the S score and S score into the virtual matter. And in the Goodman's idea, how is a score? Thank you.
Thank you. So we're talking about sort of scores in the musical sense, like so is the question of whether a score is a kind of a sequence of events or a list of events, like almost like a database, and just wondering what, trying to make sure I understand the question. So I think as I understand it, for Goodman, a score, a score is probably better thought of as a series of instructions, really, which, if you comply with them, if you obey them, you produce something which corresponds to that score. Namely, if you play the right notes in Debussy's score, even if you play them badly. I mean, I did once learn to play Clair de Lune really badly, and I got the arpeggios. They were kind of messy and not very fluent, but I got to from the beginning to the end of the piece. So I played Clair de Lune. It was just not a very good version of it. But I did play the right notes in roughly the right order. And so my performance qualified as an instance of that work. And the point that Goodman wants to make is that without this set of instructions, you wouldn't have a standard for categorizing certain performances as instances of that work. So, for example, if we all simply like the jazz musician that Martin was talking about earlier, before the talk started, if we just learnt by ear and by rote, we'd certainly have musical performances, like a lot of folk music, but there wouldn't be a kind of definite identity that you could assign to those performances, such that that they would be they would qualify as instances of a particular work. You need the score, according to Goodman, to individuate the work. So I think a score is more, for him, is more like a set of instructions. But I'm willing to admit that I didn't explain that bit as well as I could. So, but do come back, Simeon, if I've left something out. I'm hoping I understood you.
Thank you.
Okay, Simeon, thanks for your question.
Thank you, David and Simeon. I'm going to read Tom's question. Worldmaking as a term has filtered into numerous disciplines. For example, in psychoanalysis, where it has been used to say the world as culture has an unconscious that shapes and defines its processes. Do you see the unconscious in Goodman, or is he attempting a more conscious direction in the act of world making?
Wow, that's really interesting. I suppose Goodman's position in aesthetics is, as I understand it, a cognitivist one. He wants to, in a sense, say that aesthetics is that art making and science aren't all that different. They're both ways of world making. They're both ways of understanding the world. They just use different means, different structures and different materials. So I think where he's coming from, I think he would say, well, the unconscious probably has a role in all these forms of world making, insofar as, we're not always aware of the reasons why we make certain decisions, say in a poem or a novel, or even when, I don't know, creating a model of molecular structure of benzene, for example, the famous story about the chemist who discovered the structure of benzene, dreaming of a snake eating its own tail, and then thought, well, maybe it's a ring, maybe I should think about it as a ring. And of course, then you have to go off and test the hypothesis and whatever. But you could still say that the unconscious might be part of the context of discovery, even though it's not part of the context of justification, which is the kind of standard philosophy of science distinction. But I guess you could also, just alluding to the later part of my talk, you might want to argue that the unconscious has a more systematic role in the structure of worlds. If, for example, you allow that some of these processes of worlding, if you like, or becoming, are, in a sense, never fully accessible to conceptual thought, or even to conscious sort of reflection. I'm not sure if this, again, is. I'm not sure if I'm entirely responding in a satisfactory way. So, you know, at this point, if the questioner wants to come back, maybe they should, to get me on the right track.
I think you bring up good points. That's very interesting. I don't think they're here anymore, so I'll move on.
Okay. No, I'm sorry. It was just kind of, you know, yeah. I mean, it's a good point, because I'm not sure. I'm not sure what Goodman's position on the unconscious is, but whether he had a developed one. But I don't see why he shouldn't have. Somebody who knows Goodman better than me might want to come back on that.
Wait, he is here. I thought he left. I don't see him as a part of the attendees, but he just commented. So if you want to come off mute, Tom, that would be cool. If not, there's one more question from Jonathan, our last question, that I'll go ahead and read. It always seemed to me that the later talk about worlds and versions is closer to his aesthetics. It's more like the notion of an artist's verve. So the question of whether one or other work is more true or represents reality is unavailable, as we have different standards and objects of representation in Impressionism, etc. But then the puzzle is how the notion of conflict between versions come in, other than in a simple misunderstanding that all artists must be working to the same standard.
Yeah, no, I think the issue of conflict is a difficult one. Goodman alludes to it quite a lot, because it's part of the justification for the idea of many worlds, because in a sense, if at least some of these versions didn't conflict, there'd be no reason, to say that the equally right versions refer to different worlds. You know, if they didn't conflict, it would be much more appealing, perhaps, to think of them as referring to the same world. But, you know, obviously that gets, if that becomes implausible if you think of, for example, Cezanne's and say 19th century academic painting. I mean, they both, you know, or 18th century academic painting, say, you know, David's history paintings. You know, they represent the world in completely different ways, and it's not clear. You know, it's certainly not clear whether, you know, whether it makes sense to say that in this case that one's right and one's wrong. I guess the point remains that Goodman wants to make a more general ontological point, namely that or meta-ontological point, namely that there is no fact of the matter about which of any right versions is true. And there we seem to be in an area where the kind of realists would, you know, would want to be resistant. I don't think your average realist would be too worried about the idea that, say, Francis Bacon and Jacques-Louis David represent bodies in completely different ways. But they might want to come back at the claim that, say, you know, Aristotelian physics is no less right than I don't know, Newtonian or modern sort of Einsteinian or quantum physics. You know, I think a scientific realist would want to say, well, there is some sort of progress in science, some sort of gradual improved accommodation to the structure of reality, and that some theories do that objectively better than others. In some sense, they capture the reality at its joints, and it's not, they carve reality at its joints better than perhaps earlier or less deep theories. And it's not clear that Goodman can say that. And of course that does then set up a sort of distinction between art and science that I mean, I'm just thinking about Francis Bacon and the way Francis Bacon depicts a body as somehow constantly in flux, constantly unstable, whereas someone like David situates bodies in a kind of rational Euclidean space with very clear outlines and gestures. You know, two completely different ways of viewing bodies. Or do we want to say that one's right and one's wrong? I mean, here we might want to kind of say that they're both getting at some sort of underlying reality of human embodiment in fascinatingly different ways. But I'm not sure if to say this, we have to say that each one presents a different world that, in a sense, is completely distinct. I'm not sure if we have. I'm not sure if that necessarily pays a compliment to them that we. I'm not even clear, even in aesthetics, whether I want to, you know, fully embrace Goodman's pluriworldism. But I haven't. I'm aware that I haven't got a well-formed argument here, because I've mainly been considering the kind of metaphysical implications through other kinds of more directly kind of ontologically committed forms of symbol system.
All right, thank you, David. Are there any more questions or comments? It looks like that's it. I want to thank everybody for attending and participating. Thank you so much, David, for this fascinating talk. Thank you to everybody for your participation. Thank you for an Objekt for hosting, and Sepideh for coming up with this program.
Thank you so much, David. It was amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Seti, and thank you Sepideh for organising this. It's been great. You know, I mean, it's very, it's very much a kind of platform. I very much see this as a platform to develop something. It's very kind of rough and ready at this stage, so it's great to have a place to thrash out these questions and hopefully develop them in new directions. And thanks for the questions. They've just been great. They've been really, really stimulated me to sort of think more broadly about this issue.
Yes, thank you, David. Thank you, everybody. We hope to see you at the next events.